Welcome to this video tutorial on how to create an atmospheric rendering using photoscans in Rhino 8. In this video I'm going to be using a photoscan I imported from Polycam, which I went through in my previous video on this subject, and we're going to be using this to create a nice atmospheric rendering using these photoscans, some lighting and some effects to kind of get the best out of the geometry we've scanned in this model. Now to begin with, I want to set up the atmosphere and the kind of environment in the scenes, and by default you'll find if you click on the rendered view like I have done here, you're going to have this quite overall white lighting on the model. We can sort of test this also by going to render and hitting that render preview button, and you'll see it usually is quite bright. We're not going to get very defined shadows, and it's quite a sort of overall lighting that we're getting on the scene. Now if you actually want to give this a certain characteristics or atmosphere, we can use what's called HDRs, which are high dynamic range images that we can use to relight our scenes to match a certain environment. If we click on the render tab and go down to the render properties here, I'm going to make sure that I'm working in Rhino render for this session, and we're just going to scroll down to the area that says 360 environment and this kind of lighting area here. You can see under the environment we've got this kind of studio lighting model here, and this is the thing that's currently giving light to our scene, and that's also giving a color to that particular light. Now we can edit this by clicking on the little pencil tool here, and if we edit any one of these studio options it will change for all of them because they're all using that same environment map to light our scene up. So I'm just going to click on the pencil on this one here, and it will load up a separate box here where we can edit that lighting. Now currently we've got this Rhino Studio 8 kind of as our background image, and that's why our image is looking quite white and grey, because we're using this sort of lighting texture for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this out with a new HDR, but before I do that I'm going to first download this from the internet, and we're going to be using Polyhaven, which is a really good free resource for lots of HDRI images, also textures and models that we can find. And in Polyhaven, under the kind of night skies, we're going to just select a nice nighttime image that we're going to use for this particular tutorial. Now you can use any one you want. I'm going to use this one here for this particular video. We're just going to select that, and I'm not going to go too high resolution because I don't want my render times to increase, so I'm just going to go for the 2K and make sure on the HDR image, and I'm just going to hit download there like so. Now once you've downloaded that, we're then going to go back into Rhino, and under the background image I'm just going to click the X to remove that, and we're going to click to add a texture. Under the textures we want to make sure we're using that high dynamic range, so we're just going to scroll down to the HDR or high dynamic range texture like so, and we're just going to find that image that we've downloaded and hit open there. And as you can see, we then have a preview of that image which has now been applied to our texture. Now under projection, it will usually automatically understand that it's a spherical projection, i.e. it's kind of going to be an environment around our model, but just to double check, usually I just set it to spherical just to make sure that actually that is set to spherical, because sometimes depending on where you download those from, they might not pick up that it's supposed to be a spherical projection here. Once we've done that, we're going to hit OK like so, and you'll see there it's now updated for all of these settings, and if we go back and hit OK there, we're now going to have a slightly darker model because we're using a nighttime environment here. Now I'm also going to play around with those properties a little bit more just to darken it down a little bit, because I want to create some quite atmospheric lighting. For the environment I'm also going to use that studio, so it's going to use that texture also as a background for our scene, and then also under the skylight I'm just going to dim down the intensity, and we're going to make this quite low for now. Let's put it on a sort of 0.7, so it's going to be quite dark in the model, and if I hit OK you'll see now it's really dark. We're getting this kind of weird effect that's happening on the ground. Don't worry too much about that, that's just for the preview, but we've now got a much darker model. You'll see that the render preview in this case is very different to if we click on this render preview option up here, and it's always important to use that render preview to really check actually what it looks like when rendered and the lighting quality we're getting. And there you can kind of see the lighting effect we're getting in the scene. So that's my sort of overall environment lighting, and I'm just going to go back to the shaded mode now so we can see the model a little bit clearly, because sometimes having it on that rendered mode makes your computer quite slow, and it also can be quite hard to see where on this sort of darker environment mode. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to create a sort of water texture. So we're going to imagine this log is kind of sitting in the water, just to give it a bit of that background information. To do that, all I'm going to do is just create a plane here, and we're going to make it quite large, like so, just over our model. We're just going to move it to sort of center in. With that, I'm also going to lift it up slightly just so it covers some of the edges of that texture, like so. So we've got this sort of plane hitting the model. And if I go back to that rendered view, you can see there it hasn't really got a texture on it, so it's just sort of sitting in our model like so. What I'm also going to do at this stage is I'm also going to set a camera angle for this particular view. Now this could change as we go, but for now I think I'm going to try and do something like this, where we're quite low to the model, like so, and we want to have some of the reflections in this water texture we're doing. So I'm just going to pan it down, and once we're quite happy with that, I'm going to open up my named views. If you don't see this on your side panel, you might also have to go to View, Set View, and Named Views here, and you can dock it under this panel if you like. We're going to click New, then we're just going to save this out as perspective, and that way we can always jump to it when we need to find it again. Just as a quick test again, just hitting that render preview button just to see what that view is looking like. We might need to tweak that a bit later, but for now I think that should be fine. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to update this ground material to be a sort of water and a reflective sort of surface in this case. Now we've set my view as well, I can always move the plane a little bit further back just so we're getting it sort of into the background like so, as we had it previously sort of centered on the model. Now to create a water texture, all I'm going to do is go to the Render Tools tab here, and we're just going to click on the Materials tab. You can see I've got material from my kind of initial scan there, but I'm just going to make a new one by clicking on this paint tube and add a material option, and we're going to go to the physically based material. Under that, I'm going to kind of make the roughness 0, so it's very shiny material, and we're going to make the base color a sort of dark kind of turquoisey greeny blue color like so, so it feels like a sort of dark murky kind of water like so. Also under this I'm going to go to the detailed settings, and we're going to add on a base color setting, and we're also going to add on a bump setting here, and this is going to give us the ripples for our water. Under that bump and normal map, I'm going to click on the texture here, and we're going to use the turbulence texture to give a sort of wavy effect to our water. Now sometimes this can take a little bit of time to load in, depending on whether you've used these textures before or if it's the first time Rhino's loading them into the model. And with that we're going to get a few turbulence settings. Usually you don't need to play around with these too much, so for now I'm just going to click out and go back to my water here. I'm also going to up this percentage a little bit higher. We can play around with that as we sort of get into the model, but for now let's just sort of keep it on a sort of 40% like so, just for that sort of bump map. Now before I sort of check this, what I'm also going to do, we need to apply it obviously to our surface here, so we're just going to right click on the material and click Assign to Object to apply it on, and then I'm also going to give it a texture map option just by selecting that, going to texture mapping under the properties menu here. We're going to use a box mapping for this, and we're just going to draw it out roughly a sort of meter squared. It doesn't matter too much really, but it will just kind of help define the size of our texture like so. Now we can check how that looks. I'm just going to go back to the render preview here just to give it a quick render to see how that's rendering out, and you can see there I'm getting that kind of reflection in the water like so, and there we can kind of see our object. So now we've got our kind of water texture in there. You might want to play around with the amount of kind of bumpiness of that water if it's not displaying quite correctly for you, and you might also want to tweak just the angle of your camera as well as we go through the model. So let's sort of keep mine roughly around here for now. Now what I'm going to do is, my scene's still quite dark and I want to add some dramatic lighting to this scene to be able to kind of see the model and light up certain features of that. We're going to use a kind of two tones of lights here, so we're going to light it from one side in one colour and then another side in the other to create those nice highlighting effects. To do that I'm going to go into the render tools, and we're going to just add in some of these point lights here. So I'm just going to create a new point light and just add it into the scene. Now what you'll find is, if you're in a rendered view like this, we can kind of see the effect of that light on that edge there, but I can't actually see the light itself. If we click back into shaded, we can kind of see it there. It's slightly hidden, but if we go back into rendered, it sort of disappears again. So by default, that rendered view won't let me see the lights that I'm kind of working with, and this can be quite frustrating to have to switch back to the shaded view just to edit the lights here. So if you want to see those lights in your rendered view, all you need to do is, if you go down to this sort of view display options here. If we go into our display modes, we can create a copy of that rendered mode just by hitting copy on that render there. And I'm just going to call it copy of rendered. We'll call it lights 01. And then under that copy, I'm going to go down to this visibility tab, and you'll see here there's this show lights option. If we turn that on, under this new display mode I've created, I'll actually be able to see the lights, and it's not going to be any different looking to this apart from the fact that we'll be able to see our lights in our scene. So once you've done that, if we then click back on our perspective up here where we're on rendered, we're going to go down to that new copy that we made, turn it on, and there you can see your lights again. So really useful way of just being able to see some of the lights we're adding into our scene. Now from here I can then tweak the colour of the lights. I'm going to make this a kind of warmish tone, kind of orangey tone there, and I'm just going to dim the intensity a little bit down so we don't have it super intense in our scene like so. I'm also going to add a new light in here. We'll add it into the foreground. Again, if you can't see it, it's likely it's probably gone below the surface there. Sometimes it can still be quite hard to see them in rendered. I'm just going to quickly switch to shaded to find it. Then let's just move it back into our new rendered view where we can see it. There we go. And then we're just going to move this into the frame. This one I'm going to make a sort of blue tone here, so we've got a kind of nice dual tone going on. Sort of blue on one side and a kind of warm orange on the other, and let's make that 0.7 like so, and we can just move around until we get a nice angle of that. And with all of this, usually I'll sort of set the lights and then I'll go back to the render preview, test it again just to make sure it's sort of working in the scene. And there you can kind of see we've got the blue working well. I might need to lift that orangey colour up at the moment because it's still quite hidden in there, so often it's just a little bit of tweaking with these, playing around with the angle of them, playing around with also the intensity, so maybe if they're a bit dim you might want to up them as well. And then just going back to the render preview just to check that that's looking good in the scene like so there. Now it might be, if you start rendering this out, that as you can see in mine, I'm not really getting much effect on my water texture here. It's not looking kind of bumpy with the water, it looks quite crisp and the reflection looks almost like a mirror. This can sometimes happen with the mapping of the water texture, and sometimes you actually need to make it a lot smaller to be able to see the effect. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to select that water plane here. I'm just going to go into my mapping of that, so under the properties, under the texture mapping option, and I'm going to reduce that down. Let's just do it 100 by 100, and this depends. Sometimes if you're using millimeters like I am in the scene, we need to actually make that effect a bit smaller. Sometimes it depends on the scale of the model that you're using. These numbers often don't really correlate as you might think they do, so they sometimes need a little bit of tweaking. So I'm just lowering that down to 100. What I'm also going to do is under my material here, I'm going to find that turbulence bump map there, and we're just going to put it on 100% here. So we're really just dialing up that effect to be the maximum it can be. Now let's just go back to our render preview here just to sort of see what that looks like. And here you can see I'm now getting a little bit more of that sort of bumpy water effect. As we can see, slight ripples on the surface, just breaking up that reflection. So you just need to play around with that kind of intensity and the mapping just to get it working sometimes, and you might need to just adjust those figures. Often I'll kind of dial in a number, do a quick test to see how it's looking just to get it working, particularly in my scene. So now we've got our kind of two-toned lighting, and we've also got our water. I think one more piece I might do is I'm going to add one more light, just bringing that into the scene here, and we're going to do it on the sort of this side here like so. Let's just select that light. We're going to make this a sort of another orangey color, but we're going to make it a lot less intense. So let's make it a 0.3 for this particular one, and we'll just move it across slightly. Sometimes if you can't quite see it here, often just make sure that you've kind of updated your view so we're not going to lose it when we're rotating off, and then we can just spin off the model and move the light into position. You can see my light's located really far away like so, because I sort of pinned it right in the background there. If you find that your model's quite slow when you're moving around it, you can always put it back to a shaded view, be much quicker, and then we can move the lights in that into position like so. Let's just put this one here, and I just want it very subtly on the edge there, just kind of giving some highlights to the scene. And we'll go back to our view, turn it back on rendered like so, and then we'll just do a quick render preview just to get that in the scene. There we go, and then we've got this kind of nice glow on that outside edge. So now we're sort of building up our scene. We've got our lights, we've got our kind of main object, and we've got our sort of reflections on our water. I think what I'm going to do now is start to build this in a little bit more. We've got our background, which isn't really working, it's just the sort of HDRI, so I might need to add something new in there, or we can slightly tilt the camera to hide it. And then we also might need to add a few more objects into the foreground here. Now to do that, I'm actually going to just use more objects from Polyhaven. In here we've got a lot of different models that we can explore, so we can download a few different ones of these that we can start to bring into our scene and use to populate some of those objects. I'm going to use some of these planting assets here, some of the trees, and then also some of the ground assets and rocks, just to sort of build up a little bit more detail in my scene to add to those effects. So I'm going to fast forward this part of the video while we just download some more of these objects in, and it's very much the same way as we did with the other objects, just clicking on them here, hitting that download button, and then importing them into our scene, and we're going to use that to sort of build up some of the complexity here. Now we've built up the scene in a little bit more detail, I'm going to just go back to the render preview, and to finish off we're going to add a few post effects onto the scene just to add a little bit more atmosphere. You can see here I've added some roots, we've got some ferns in there as well, and then as a final touch I'm going to click on this post effects option and we're going to add a fog into the scene. To work with this fog we can pick a kind of start and end distance. Usually the start you want to be the object kind of quite close to you, and then the end, one of the further points in the scene there. You can always kind of just tweak and play around with that if you wanted to go further back, and usually I just drop that strength right down to something like a kind of 5 or 6, so it's not too heavy in the scene. You can also tweak the colour. Usually I like to give it a little bit of a tint. If we make it a slight blue tone, for example, it just kind of gets it in keeping with the rest of the scene. You can also add in things like kind of bloom effects just to give a little bit of a glow to things. These usually work if we can see some of the lights in our scene, but they just add a little bit of a kind of glow, you can see in the foreground there, to certain elements of the scene. Once you're happy with those, we're then going to just render that out at a high resolution. So usually when you close it, it asks you if you would like to save those effects. We're just going to hit yes for this time. We're then going to go to render, under the render properties, and we're going to just set our resolution to be quite high, so I'm going to keep it on custom. We're going to lock it to the aspect ratio of the view, but then let's put it at a sort of 2500 for now, so it's relatively high resolution, and we'll put the quality either on good or final. The difference between these is essentially the time it takes to render out the final image. The more samples you have, as you can kind of see in the brackets here, the higher resolution and higher kind of quality of the image it's going to be. So I'm going to put mine on a final quality, hit OK, and when we're ready we're going to first just save the view just before we click render. Reason for that is often when you render something out it can have a kind of potential to crash perhaps. If you've kind of put too much stuff in the scene it can get very slow, so always just safe to save your model out just so we've got a copy of it just in case that model does crash when we hit the render button. So we're just going to click save there just to save out our file, and then we're going to hit that render button there, and this is going to render out our scene in high resolution. My render's now finished rendering out, and from here we can take this into Photoshop. We could start to play around with some of the lighting qualities and other details in that image, and we can kind of really bring that up to create the most sort of atmospheric and kind of immersive rendering from this effect. So I hope you found this video tutorial useful. This was just a quick introduction into how we can start to create atmospheric renderings using Rhino's built-in render engine and using photoscans from places like Polycam or other resources like Polyhaven that we can find online. I hope you found this video useful, and if you want to watch any other tutorials on rendering, visualizing and drawing in Rhino, please do check out the videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.